Oh boy, NASA, why are you getting into this? Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and I guess I'm going to have to talk about this after all. About a week ago from when I'm making this video, NASA has officially announced that they're going to be setting up a kind of an independent group to study the so-called UAPs, also more commonly known as UFOs. And that's where a lot of science communicators sort of scratch their head and realize that we don't really know, or at least I don't really know, what to think and how to talk about this. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about my own opinions about this near the end of the video, but I actually decided to sort of plagiarize a little bit and read this beautiful post by another science communicator, Nadia Drake, the daughter of the iconic Drake. Not this Drake, but this one, Dr. Frank Drake, the scientist behind the iconic Drake equation, the equation that tries to estimate the total number of alien civilizations potentially living out there. Although personally I have to apologize to Nadia for basically using her father to try to explain who she is, because I'm sure she's a wonderful person in her own right. But sometimes for a child of an iconic person, it sort of becomes pretty difficult to live up to the society's expectations. Although she's doing pretty fine, she's actually writing incredible articles, and I definitely enjoy reading all of them. So anyway, here's what she wrote. By now you've all heard that NASA is convening a panel to look into UFOs. I took about 24 hours to reflect on what seems like an interesting and somewhat unexpected move. First and most importantly, I really wish the on-hold music for yesterday's press briefing had been the X-Files theme. Okay, NASA is clearly not the FBI, but still, missed opportunity. More seriously, is it weird that NASA is investing resources in studying UAP? Yes, in the sense that UAP are as much a cultural phenomenon as they are aerial. It's a bit like convening a task force to study ghosts, or pick your favorite paranormal thing, which yes, that's odd. And I think one of the biggest questions is, why do this now? On the other hand, it makes perfect sense for a space agency to focus on these reports. As others have noted, the first A in NASA is aeronautics, so why not take a look at what might be buzzing around Earth by harnessing the power of science and the scientific method? To me, it sounds like taking a hard look at the available data is the point of the study, not going on an alien hunt. And I don't think the headlines framing this as UFO hunting are correct. Catchy, yes. Accurate? No. I don't buy for a second that anyone involved reasonably expects to find evidence of extraterrestrial technology here. To me, that didn't sound like the goal of the endeavor, which seems more geared toward objective analysis and patching observational holes. I also don't think there is much of a connection between this inquiry and NASA's astrobiology research. The latter is a maturing field of science that NASA has been cultivating for decades. This UAP panel, not really in line with that, in my opinion. Rather, I believe Dr. Zurbuchen when he said that it makes sense to apply the scientific method as we would with any natural phenomenon. I think there is new science to be discovered. There's been many times when something that looked almost magical turned out to be new science. Don't ever underestimate what nature can do for you, there is a lot to learn. And from Dr. Spergel, who's leading the panel, we don't know what makes up 95% of the universe. There is a lot we don't know about how the cosmos works. In other words, I don't see this study as throwing a bone to the folks who truly believe we've been visited by extraterrestrials. Sorry. It's just a good way of figuring out how to address and understand a puzzling set of data. When I asked my Papa D, that's Papa D by the way, you know the guy who might want to find evidence of smart aliens more than just about any human on the planet, but who is also 100% skeptical on UFO sightings, he offered the following thought. You can't just throw it all away, it's worth plowing through. True to his word, he's done a fair share of investigating sightings over the decades and has never been even remotely convinced. And so I'm really curious to see how this all plays out, and I'll be disappointed if the big takeaway is that the study lends validity to the belief that UAP are evidence of extraterrestrial technology. Those dots don't connect yet, and maybe they never will. But maybe that's an inevitable response. We'll see. That's all from me for now. Live long and prosper. And honestly, I could not have said any better. So I didn't. I basically plagiarized, and I'm so sorry. Please don't sue me. But do check out her Twitter profile, because her pictures and her stories are absolutely mind-blowing. Anyway, so what she said is totally correct. And actually for one simple reason. So it's true that the idea of UFOs, or UAPs, whatever you want to call them, up until now has been a bit of a taboo, mostly because, well, I mean, what exactly are we going to be studying? Are we studying people seeing things? Are we actually going to be studying observations? And as a matter of fact, so far none of this has been science. None of this has been scientific at all. And here's the important part. So if I use the website that I've been using for decades to try to collect papers and try to read through various studies, the website that has the largest collection of all of the astronomical papers in existence, Archive, And if I try to search for UFOs or UAPs or studies related to that, here's what I find. And just for fun, take a guess how many I'm going to find. Take a guess. I'm going to wait. Maybe post it in the comments. Okay, done. Here we go. So for UFOs, I find 155, but none of them are related to what we're talking about. Because UFOs also mean unified feature optimization, or ultra-fast outflows. And the list goes on. If I were to look up unidentified flying objects, I find one single paper. And wait a second, it's from James Davenport. I've read his stuff before. He's actually really good. And it's a legit paper about studying UFOs using various types of new surveys, where he basically talks about how we could potentially find these objects as tiny specks of light in surveys using modern telescopes. Wait, how come nobody's ever talked about this before? This sounds kind of interesting, but then it sort of hit me. Is it gonna hit you too? Look closer. Much closer. No, look again. Yeah, there we go. It was an April Fool's joke. So that's kind of where we are. A lot of scientists and a lot of science communicators, and actually a lot of people in general, do not think of this, whatever that is, as anything worth studying scientifically, mostly because, well, first of all, there doesn't seem to be an agreement on what people are seeing and if they're seeing anything, and second of all, there's really no scientific way to study any of this right now. And the previous research, such as the famous Project Blue Book, well, unfortunately, it does have a lot of conflicts inside of it, and the conclusions at the end of the project were super inconclusive. And as a matter of fact, when I actually first heard about this, my first question was not why it took so long, like with Nadia Drake. My first question was, is someone actually forcing them to do this? Is it somehow related to the pressure from other government agencies, where they're basically forced to release everything they have on these UAPs? And the answer is probably yes. I think there is some kind of a political pressure, but I don't want to go into politics or the reasons. I really, for now at least, until they publish something, want to focus on the facts, and I guess to some extent, my opinions at the end. So first of all, the facts. One of the main reasons to investigate the phenomenon is to actually see if it does have any danger to a lot of airplanes. This is, if it exists, an aeronautical phenomenon. Is it actually causing air safety, and is there any national security issues here as well? And so trying to figure out which of these phenomena are natural and which of them are possibly just observations or misinterpretations from the ground is very important. And here's a really important message from NASA. They mentioned this several times. There's absolutely no evidence, there's no evidence at all that UFOs are somehow related to extraterrestrial intelligence. And you have to really kind of focus on this. Remember, NASA has been actually searching for aliens, for extraterrestrial intelligence, for several decades. There are several very important and very prominent institutes, such as SETI for example, that have been doing this for so long and have compiled tons and tons of data. None of this suggests that these phenomena are somehow related or that there is really anything going on Earth that could have potentially come from outer space. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. And just the science and the math behind it really does not add up. But then why do people connect these phenomena all the time? Why is it that always whenever you hear UFOs, people think aliens? Well, that's how our brain works. That's essentially human psychology. And all of this really started back in 1947 with the so-called Roswell UFO incident, where some of the local newspapers posted a few articles that sort of implied that something unusual was going on here, and eventually one thing led to another, and the Cold War paranoia turned into the idea of these UFOs being aliens. Now, it didn't actually pick up right away, it took a few decades, but eventually it sort of solidified in our minds as UFOs equal aliens. Even though pictures like this, with this being Major Jesse Marcel posing with the debris he found in 1947, clearly show that this seems to be some sort of aluminum foil. And even though originally it was claimed that this is probably some kind of a weather balloon, it's most likely to have been some kind of a military experiment, and the US military has been conducting so many of them at that time. And obviously, to cover up the story that this was a military experiment, they would not mind to shift the attention to aliens. Actually, wait a second. Is that what's happening right now? Is that why NASA suddenly is talking about this? Are they shifting attention from something important, such as possibly lack of funding and possibly economy in trouble? Yeah, I would not be surprised. Anyway, moving on. The point I'm trying to make here is that it's all psychology. All of this has more to do with the psychological concepts than it does with physical concepts. There are so many different biases at work here, and so it's actually extremely difficult for us, human beings, to interpret the world without some kind of a standardized way, such as science. We have so many biases, and so many of them have created these concepts. And actually, the most important psychological bias that does apply to this phenomenon is known as the representativeness heuristic. It's sort of related to how we assign categories to novel objects, even when certain novel objects really do not belong in those categories. And so as this picture sort of illustrates, We kind of think of various aerial phenomena that are probably completely unrelated to one another as UFOs, and we then also think of all of these UFOs as some kind of extraterrestrial intelligence. But more importantly, there are so many other biases that prevent us from then changing this opinion. For example, there is something called blind spot bias. It's essentially not actually realizing that you are biased at all. There's also something known as the clustering illusion, and this is a tendency for us to see patterns in random events. And we also have very important confirmation bias. We tend to only listen to information that literally confirms what we already believe. In other words, people will usually not really listen to the information that contradicts their view already. That's very, very common. And when it comes to this investigation, there's another really important bias that's going to affect what's going to happen. There is something known as the conservatism bias. It's essentially where people believe prior evidence more than new evidence or information that has emerged. In other words, people that have already established their belief in UFOs as aliens, well, it's going to be extremely hard to convince them otherwise. Wait, there's more. There's actually one other important one. Why do people even interpret these UFOs or these unusual objects in the skies as something super weird, something super unusual such as aliens? Well, this is where this other idea of salience comes in. Salience is a tendency for human brain to focus on the most easily recognizable features of a person or a concept. For example, focusing on something very weird and something very unusual. In other words, people generally almost instantly focus on the weird stuff and will generally ignore stuff that's kind of normal and kind of boring. So if we hear aliens and alien technology, we instantly click on the video. If we hear aliens are just basically some weird air phenomena we just didn't know existed, it's just not weird enough and people will probably ignore it. And that's basically our selective perception at work. We tend to have expectations about the world and we only tend to focus on those expectations. In other words, we all tend to only see things we kind of want to see, or hear things we want to hear. However, there is another really important part of neuroscience that's going to affect all of this, and that's the studies of human memory. So one of the main differences in early UFO studies, so here we're talking about the Project Blue Book, compared to what's going to be happening now, is the fact that we've learned so much about how human memory works. And this is actually the most important part of all of this. For example, in the last few decades, we've definitively established that human memory does not work like your typical computer or a typical camera. And so when we're forming new memories, it's not just bits of information being saved inside our brains. But instead, if we were to look at two separate people forming the same memory, their biases and their, lenses, and here we're talking about cognitive lenses, would actually form two completely different memories based on their biases, based on their perception, based on their expectations about things in life. And that's of course the most important part. If you and I see the same thing, we're going to see things very differently and we're going to remember them very differently. In other words, memory formation is a very active process that's entirely based on your life experiences to date. But then, when we actually start recalling these memories, it's once again not just reading a hard drive. It's also an active process, and once again also based on your bias and your expectations in life, but this time right now, not the ones from before. Meaning that if you're recalling the same memory, let's just say a decade later, you're not going to be remembering the same thing at all. You're going to be remembering your idea of this memory as you would interpret it today. And these memories in neuropsychology are very often referred to as engrams, and I've briefly talked about this in one of the previous videos about neurons that you can probably find somewhere in the description, or maybe somewhere right there. But the idea here is somewhat complicated. Memories are always different, they always change, and they change as you get older. And I guess that's a bit of a scary part. As we get older, our actual memories change as well, and what we remember is different from how it really was. All of this is, by the way, based on like decades and decades of different studies, and this has been confirmed so many times. Two people seeing the same thing are not going to be remembering the same thing the same way. More importantly, there's also something known as false memories. And that's of course the concept that became super important in the last few decades. We always form false memories. Memories of events that did not happen or did not exist. And unfortunately, there's really no way for us to know if they really happened, because that's not how our brain works. So in some sense, our brains sometimes sort of fool us. We think something happened, but it actually didn't. I guess the most iconic false memory that seemed to have affected a lot of people is the so-called Mandela effect. It's this strange and unusual memory a lot of people used to have, a memory that was actually quite vivid and quite detailed, about the South African Nelson Mandela potentially dying in prison in the 80s. Whereas in reality, he died in 2013, and died quite peacefully. And I guess the other more interesting example that some people might relate to is the memory of the movie that never existed. There are actually people that are convinced that the comedian Sinbad was the main actor in the movie Shazam, the movie that came out in the 90s. He wasn't though. This movie doesn't exist and he's never played in it. There is a movie called Kazam with Shaquille O'Neal, but not the same at all. Yet for many years, a lot of people that grew up in the 90s were convinced that it was real. It even became a kind of an ongoing joke on the internet. And so these are all false memories. We actually form them all the time. And because of this, any kind of an eyewitness account of UFOs, flying objects, or anything to do with unexplained phenomena is extremely difficult to study. None of this is scientific. For all we know, these are actually all examples of false memories being formed based on certain observations that have been misinterpreted or might have never existed. And that's the tricky part about the human brain. How do we then study all of this? Well, that's where NASA is going to have to figure all of this out. Oh, okay, I know. There's going to be someone in the comments right now probably writing about all these videos released by the military, by the Air Force, by a lot of other agencies that claim to show us UFOs or claim to show us something unusual happening in the night skies. And this is where I'm actually going to mention Michio Kaku, who recently talked about this to some extent, which by the way is also a really good example of bias once again. In one of the recent interviews, he talked about how the military is now basically releasing hours of videotapes of things that defy normal laws of physics. We now have frame-by-frame analysis of these objects. These objects can drop 70,000 feet in a few seconds, suggesting that something strange is maybe going on here after all. Okay, well here's the thing though, that's not that video. This one is just produced by someone else. This is a fake. The real video is right here, and it doesn't show anything extraordinary or anything unusual. And here's the important part. Every single one of these released videos so far has been definitively proven to show absolutely nothing extraordinary by wonderful people like Mick West right here, who's been doing this pretty much weekly, or sometimes even daily. He gets a lot of different videos, and he's been doing this for many years, and he's very good at basically discrediting anything we're seeing, and even showing exactly what's going on, and not a single one of these videos showed anything extraordinary. And honestly, if you are someone interested in UFOs, you absolutely have to follow Mick, because he's been doing an absolutely incredible job. Such an incredible job, as a matter of fact, that I've sort of realized that whenever he says something is really weird and unusual, maybe something is worth investigating after all, that's when I'm going to start believing something is out there. Until then, he's done an amazing job explaining everything. You can also check out my previous video that I've made, I guess about a year ago, that goes through all of this in more detail. Right there, or in the description. Alternatively, you can also check out this other video that's also in the description below, that essentially has several video effects artists, very good ones as a matter of fact, talking about all of this, specifically discussing what they're observing, what exactly it's probably showing, and more importantly, specifically stating that nothing here is unusual. In most cases, like for example, in this famous case, that's basically nothing but an out-of-focus airplane with the triangular shape itself simply formed by the aperture of the camera. A lot of somewhat expensive cameras sometimes will have them as triangles. And so none of this, absolutely none of this, is unexplained or unusual, or it requires an explanation using alien technology. Which is why I want to come back to this particular tweet from Mick West, where he challenged Michio Kaku to back up his claims that there are unusual phenomena happening somewhere out there, and that they were actually filmed and documented. I haven't seen one, he hasn't seen one, I don't think anyone has seen one. And if someone thinks they've seen one, go back to that previous part about the false memories. So, Dr. Kaku, it's all on you now. The ball is in your court. But wait, there's more. As a matter of fact, there's a lot more. I don't know if I'll be able to cover everything in this video. Maybe there will be part 2. The other part I wanted to talk about is also cultural. In a sense that UFO phenomenon is not actually a universal experience. It doesn't seem to be very popular in places like Asia, for example. However, what is very universal to everyone is having different myths and different legends. Or actually, to be more exact, it's very common for different cultures or for different groups of people to have the same idea of something and to believe in something without an actual proof through simple hearsay, through the word of the mouth. And that actually exists everywhere, except that it's never the same thing. Okay, maybe some things are the same, like for example, a lot of cultures have ideas of dragons, but when it comes to things that people truly believe in, they tend to be somewhat different. And personally, I've only started to realize this when I started to live in completely different cultures. Now, I've been in South Korea for quite a while now, and here, absolutely nobody cares about UFOs. They might think it exists, they might think it doesn't exist, but they just don't care. There are, however, some groups of people, and actually a lot of older Koreans, that believe in a lot of things that we in the West would find very unusual and somewhat odd. There's a really good example that you kind of learn about when you just come to Korea. The phenomenon is called fan death. It's a weird belief that if you were to leave your fan running in the middle of the night, you're going to die. Especially if you do so in a room with closed windows and closed doors. And there are articles from just about 10 years ago, from 2011, that basically discuss at least one death that a lot of people think is from the fan death. And this might sound really strange to you, but many people here, many people in their 50s, their 60s, or even people in their 40s will actually take this as a granted. They will truly believe this. They will never turn on their fan in the middle of the night, especially if the windows and if the doors are closed. But none of this is obviously proven, and none of this has any science behind it, and there are obviously even conspiracy theories about this. Some people think that maybe it was actually South Korean propaganda created by the government in order to prevent the energy use during the 70s when there was an energy crisis. But there were stories even from before that, from the 20s and the 30s, when a lot of the new technology started to appear, and so in that sense, even today it's not really known where all of this started. But it's been alive and well in Korea for several decades. This belief is just as prominent in South Korea as a lot of other, I guess, somewhat irrational beliefs that you can find somewhere in the West. And so in that sense, well, these beliefs, these legends, are universal. And so to some extent, this is kind of where we are right now with the UFOs being aliens, and with this whole idea of unidentified flying objects. It has become a kind of a Western legend. A legend that's going to be very difficult to prove or disprove, but it's a legend that NASA is now going to be studying. Now, is it real? Is it fantasy? Well, only time will tell. But at the moment, I definitely see it as just a legend, as just a myth, something that was created by the media, by the movies, by the psychological connections between several different subjects, and to some extent, maybe even similar to our fascination with the concept of zombies. We know that this is not real, but you know, some people think that maybe it could even happen. So that's, I guess, my take on all of this, and I guess to some extent so far this has been mostly opinions. Let's talk about what NASA is actually factually going to be doing about this. We know that it's going to take approximately 9 months to complete the study, and it's going to cost very likely approximately $100,000, which is of course a super small amount for any kind of a NASA inquiry, which once again pivots to my original point that maybe this is because of some pressure from the top, and they're just doing this to show someone that they're doing something. But that's of course just speculation. Another goal here is to try to talk about this in the open finally, and to possibly involve science after all, in order to basically remove the stigma associated with talking about UFOs. They're also going to be producing annual reports and possibly semi-annual briefings to the Congress, and are going to try to focus on identifying which events are natural and trying to see if anything is going to be causing any safety to the aircraft. But the initial investigation is just going to be collecting data, trying to dig up all of the data from the sightings, and figuring out how to best record such events in the future. But hopefully they can also create some kind of a category system where we can maybe assign different sightings or different observations to different categories, because at the moment calling everything a UFO or UAP is kind of misleading. It seems to be different phenomena, some of them psychological, some of them misunderstood flying craft that are basically human-made, and some of them are just balloons. Maybe some of them are something, but we want to place them in different categories so there is no confusion in the future. But the first task, as I mentioned, is just going to be gathering data. A lot of robust data that can be used for scientific studies, and that's going to be the difficult part. None of the data so far has been robust enough. All of this is also going to be led by the Princeton University's David Spergel, the astrophysicist who's most well known for his work with so-called WMAP, the survey that produced one of the maps of the cosmic microwave background using the microwave radiation, which means that we can expect a very scientifically rigorous approach to all of this. But the question is it worth it? Well, I guess it is worth it, because at least 11 of these so-called UFO observations have now been connected to potential near collisions with US military aircraft. And this was reported back in May during the defense expert testimony. But because most of these seem to happen around military craft or military vessels, maybe this is actually some kind of a military technology after all, and possibly from an adversary that could be right here on Earth. Maybe it's another country. And so maybe all of this will actually have some kind of a military explanation after all. But all of this will of course be discussed later on when we hear back about the report and we have some conclusions from this. At the moment, we don't really know where all of this goes, or if they're even able to collect enough good data to be used in various scientific studies and investigations. At the moment, it really doesn't look like that. And so only time will tell where all of this goes. For now though, I'm still going to be super skeptical about all of this, as should be you. And as should be everyone, simply based on what I've told you in this video. There are so many things about our memory, our brain that is just very complex. There are so many things we still don't understand about ourselves. And more importantly, we actually have active programs that try to find aliens somewhere out there, trying to find life on other planets. And people like Dr. Drake right here have been trying to do so for decades. Yet, he's not convinced that UFOs are anything important. Neither am I. Neither is Mick West. But we'll know more in about a year from now. So expect a follow-up at some point. Maybe even sooner than you think. So subscribe, maybe share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. And also check out the Twitter accounts and YouTube accounts of people I mentioned in this video because they have so much cool stuff to say and they're way smarter than me as well. On that note, thank you for watching. Maybe support the channel on Patreon by joining channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye. So initially when I was going to make this video, I was going to wear my favorite t-shirt, this one, with aliens. But then I didn't, because, well, first of all, green screen, which would make me appear really interesting, and second of all, well, UFOs are not aliens. And so until I change the green screen to something else, well, I guess the t-shirt is going to stay as part of my private collection.